Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Kelly Spring about her book titled Spam, A Global History, published by Reaktion in 2025. This book is, well, the title says it all, doesn't it? Spam, A Global History. Now, to be clear here, if you're really hungry right now listening, this may not be the episode to listen to if you don't have some food readily available, because we're going to be talking about the incredibly popular global food of spam and help understand why it's so globally popular. How did we get to this point? Obviously looking at the US, but going to a whole bunch of other places as well. So Kelly, thank you for coming onto the podcast to tell us about spam.
Hi, Miranda. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Could you please start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us why you decided to write this book?
Yes. So I am a food historian, and my focus and research is British and American food history, particularly in relation to World War II. And so I've worked on a lot of different projects. My PhD was at the University of Manchester looking at British food rationing and gender in World War II. And so I chose to do this topic because it kind of connects with my research, about it's very much a story of World War II. In most of the book talks about its connection throughout the world in World War II. And then I chose to write this book because it's basically a pandemic project. So, we had loads of time during the pandemic. We were just kind of stuck at home. And so as a food historian, my hobby is research. So I think all the time about research and food. And so I had time on my hands to I started really looking at British history in relation to spam in World War II. So I would look at the British Library's online newspaper collection for World War II and start looking for mentions of spam, really. And it was sort of an entertainment for me. I enjoyed doing it. And originally it was going to be an article, I thought, or just to, while away the time while we were sort of stuck at home. And then my friend, Dr. Marcy Friedman, sort of sent me this call for books from Reaktion Press and said, why don't you make this a new book, and sort of grew from there. So it was a really fun experience to write it, and I really enjoyed it.
Oh, that's so lovely to hear about a fun writing and research project that ends up in a book like this. So what a lovely introduction to our conversation. Talking then about spam, I mentioned briefly in the introduction that it's really popular. I think most people probably know that. They may not realize how popular. So can you clarify that for us so we understand the stakes of this discussion?
Yes. So I would say it's a range of popularity. So it's in many countries in the world. So spam is sold in 50 countries in the world. So it's sold, it's made in the United States. It's sold here. It's sold in the UK. But it's also sold in Asia. So Korea, Philippines, Guam, and so on. And so it has this long history from World War II and then in Korea, the Korean War. And so in the US and the UK, the popularity sort of waxes and wanes a bit. But in Korea, it's hugely popular. So, for example, South Korea is the largest sort of buyer of spam, and Guam is the largest consumer of spam. And so in Guam, for example, they eat 16 tins of spam on average per person per year, which is much more than we eat in the United States. If we look at the United States itself, Hawaii is the number one consumer of spam. And again, this relates to the war. Hawaii is the Indo-Pacific Command of the U.S. military. And so you have this influx of American soldiers during World War II. As well, you have a population which has an influx of Asian immigrants before and after the war. And so they bring with them spam as well. So spam is it's interesting. It sort of exists there on the shelves, and everybody knows about it, but I think everybody doesn't know, as you said, how popular it is and really the importance of it in history.
Yeah, definitely a very helpful place to start our conversation going, okay, this is a big deal, right?
Yes. Surprisingly, it's a little can that you think, okay, it's just there on the shelf. But it really has an enormous impact in the world.
The other thing I think many people will be somewhat aware of, but maybe don't necessarily think a lot about it or go, oh, well, I know the answer, is, of course, what spam stands for. You've gone and done some investigation. What is the answer?
The answer is nobody knows, actually. Hormel, which makes spam, it's an American company, does not reveal the answer to that. And so online, you can see a lot of speculation, and people think it sort of stands for spiced ham or some other variation. There are also some derogatory versions of it, which I don't include in the book, but if you want to Google it, you certainly can. So there's no answer to this. So you can either make up your own answer or just sort of enjoy it as an unusual word, I guess.
Yes, I definitely did think there was an answer. And then I read the book and was like, oh, okay, never mind. As a historian, I think that's much more interesting, to be honest.
What did you think the answer was? I mean, what was your assumption about what?
The one I'd always heard growing up was specially prepared American ham.
Okay, yes, that's one version of it.
Yeah.
So
that's
you can imagine, yeah, so people who live abroad might, think that that's what it is. Yeah, no answer.
Some myth busting already in our conversation. Moving then to origin stories, let's see what we can do here. Can you help us understand when, how, and why Spam was created?
Certainly. So a lot of people sort of have the idea that it was made in World War II, and that's when it really came into its own. But actually, it was made in 1937. So the Hormel Corporation, which is based in Austin, Minnesota, and still is today, produced this product. So they had leftover pork shoulder, which wasn't very popular ingredient before, and as a business, they want to use all the resources that they have at their disposal. This is the height of the Great Depression, and so they wanted to make a canned product which would be easy to produce, inexpensive for families to buy, and allowed them to, have some sort of source of protein. So you can think like, there's huge unemployment. It's difficult for people to afford to eat properly, and so this gives them an inexpensive way to have protein. So the can is designed as a way to feed essentially a family of 4. And so that's how they kind of figured their proportions there. It's sort of sealed in the can, and so that makes it very shelf stable. It's transportable, and that's very useful, if you, have trouble with housing, or if you have trouble, like you can't afford fuel in the Depression. And so it becomes very useful in that aspect. And then later it sort of takes on the world, as it were. It was very much more a domestic product before the war.
Okay, that's definitely good to know because of how much we associate it with World War II. If we're thinking then about this initial period, though, what made it popular in the US and the UK?
So it was really popular. I think really the Hormel Corporation had a really good marketing program, and they put a lot into marketing. So they advertised on the newspaper, and they advertised in women's magazines, and they advertised in newspapers, and they put a lot of money towards that. And that really helped push the product. And they used, very famous, like entertainers at the time to provide this sort of connection and sort of raise people's awareness about it. And so that made it really popular at the time, before the war even.
That's really interesting to hear how far back the marketing goes with Spam, because I think that's still something we think about today. I know, for example, in South Korea, and you have a bunch of these examples in the book, like the marketing around this is still a really big deal. So to hear that that's a thing, even before we get to World War II, definitely starts to make sense about this popularity. But going into the war, to be honest, it kind of seems like this wouldn't be a successful time for Spam because there were so many rations, there were so many restrictions, there were so many shortages. So how was Spam impacted and how did they adapt?
Yeah, that was a really interesting story. So, during the wartime in the US and the UK and elsewhere, the governments would reduce the amount of like branded products and sort of require the companies, had to do that because they didn't have the supplies anymore. And Hormel's no exception to that. So they had to reduce the number of lines that they had, the number of products that they sold. So in addition to Spam, they sell a whole bunch of other tin meats products. And so what I think really helped them was they had government contracts. So Spam becomes an important part, and products like Spam. So they had something called defense Spam, defense ham, which is a sort of variation on that. So they had products that were geared towards supporting the American soldiers and feeding into the Lend-Lease program, which was a food aid program that the American government approved to send to our allies, such as the UK. And so because Hormel had sort of these government contracts, a lot of their production swung to the government side. So I would say a large portion of what they produced was not for the domestic market anymore, but it was for the government's needs, be it the soldiers or for this food aid program. And so that really helped them. So they continued to make Spam throughout the war, supplying the US government. And that was really smart business and smart for their bottom line, I would say.
Yeah, that definitely seems like quite a sensible adjustment. There aren't that many options in that context, but it works. So I was particularly fascinated to read then about Spam becoming gendered in the popular imagination sort of not long after this point, because if we're talking supplying the military, then there's a whole lot of like men going around eating Spam as kind of the main thing. So how do we get to a point where kind of gender is so tightly tied to Spam? And can you give us some examples of what that looked like?
Yes, thank you. That's a really good question, good sort of thought about how that connects you with that. So in the US, I would say like meat rationing was less pervasive or less restrictive than in the UK. And then people, I would say, are familiar with Spam beforehand. So, I think there's less of a gender connotation in the domestic sense. In the military sense, you're quite right. They're eating Spam. They're not necessarily enjoying it, but that's sort of a good source of protein that the military can provide to the men, particularly when you have these sort of issues with meat supply. And because it's shelf stable, it's easy to transport around the world to the soldiers, to the mess halls. And so that becomes something that is very useful to them, when they don't have other supplies of meat. I don't know if it would be preferred by them or not. There's a range of opinions about Spam by the soldiers at this time. In terms of the UK, it's really interesting. I found when I was looking at the research, so Spam is kind of ubiquitous throughout the British sort of home front at this time. Spam becomes part of the sort of personal points, which was an aspect of the ration system where people could have certain number of points per month. It was 16 or 20 points, depending on which year we're talking about. And then people could spend it on things like canned goods or rice or, whatever. So they got these points per month. And then, so Spam becomes part of that. And so I found in the research that when people would be out sort of in cafes or something and they would have a lot of Spam, for example, in sandwiches, they would sort of often consider this as sort of women's food and sort of give women Spam where they would sort of hold on to the meat that they had for men. Excuse me. So this is very much the sort of gender divide going on. You also have like some newspaper articles where they're showing that men are really getting sick of taking Spam sandwiches to work for lunch, and they want meat, so that there's some domestic disputes around that as well. But I mean, that was really good supply of protein. And so, sometimes women, that's how they coped with that. They would send Spam sandwiches. So it's really interesting, all these different gender dynamics going on here.
Yeah, it is really interesting. Did these gender dynamics in the UK and the US continue after the war, or was it more just a thing during the war itself?
I think it was very much a thing during the war, during, this time rather than after, because you had this sort of reduction in meat supply. So it's like, who's going to get the meat? So if we think sort of traditionally in the UK, it's often the working man who gets the meat, who gets the preference, where the woman would sort of settle for less, as it were. And so after the war, they're still rationing in the UK, but it sort of changes a bit in that sense. And I don't think it's the same sort of idea going on. There's no more Lend-Lease, so there's less Spam coming in as well. And I think very much at the end of the war, the British were very sick of Spam. They didn't want it. So they would try to get something else. You can see their sort of war weary and Spam essence, in the US, I think because Spam is still here, in the 1950s and 1960s, you have this rise of kind of convenience food, sort of TV dinners kind of thing. And so Spam sort of figures into that. So I think Spam is popular at that time, and there isn't this sort of gender dynamic so much going on there.
Okay, that's helpful to understand. It's really interesting then to move to a different country that you look at in the book, because as much as Britons are maybe getting sick of Spam, you talk about how it actually becomes a comfort food throughout the Pacific, for example, in the Philippines. So in one place we're seeing, no, please no more. In another place we're seeing like, ooh, yay, this reminds me of nice things. How does that work?
Yeah, so I think you could think about like Spam going through a transition in these sort of Asian countries. So during wartime, you can think about, for example, places like the Philippines or Guam. They were occupied for much of the time by the Japanese, so they get sort of liberated by the Americans in 1944, and so the people there are starving. They didn't have any kind of organized rationing like we see in the US or the UK. And so Spam becomes a really sort of lifeline of giving vital food to these populations that are living there. And so that's really important, that it sort of has a stream value of reversing the kind of hunger and starvation there. And then you see that also repeated in the Korean War, where the Korean government is not well formed at this point. This is right after the war, after Japanese occupation and colonization, and they don't have organized rationing either. And so the American soldiers come in and they have Spam, either giving it for gifts or giving it for information, or they also sell the scraps of Spam and other American things from the mess hall to the Koreans. And so it has this kind of dual thing. So in the war, it represents poverty and hunger and starvation. But after the war, it becomes sort of synonymous with American lifestyle. And it sort of changes its value. And as you're saying, this kind of idea of comfort food, it becomes a kind of luxury. So I've heard like from people in the Philippines that I've talked to, like Spam is kind of an expensive product. And that's really remarkable considering the different value it has in the US and the UK post-war.
Yeah, that's definitely really interesting as a comparison. Was Hormel doing anything to adapt their products to these different markets to make them popular to different cuisines or anything like that?
I think, in some sense, in Korea, they're sort of helping with advertising. So you can see it being linked, especially the initial advertisements, being linked with American lifestyle, American ways of sort of everyday life. One of the early advertisements is showing a Korean woman, young Korean woman, in a sort of American cowboy outfit. So giving this idea of like freedom and openness and all these interesting connections with American way of being. So it's almost like a form of American soft power when they show that. In terms of adapting the recipes or thinking about how it's sort of in the food, I think in some ways that was very organic. So people took the Spam and they sort of integrated it in some of their traditional dishes. So, for example, if we think about Korea again, that's in dishes like kimchi jjigae, which is a kimchi stew. So, either adding meat or replacing, for example, another like pork product. Budae jjigae, which is a result of the war. So it's a sort of collection of Spam and kimchi, which is fermented cabbage, which is very popular in Korea, and things like American baked beans and cheese and noodles. And so you can see the sort of wartime connection in there. And so I think people take on Spam and it becomes integrated into their own foodways. And you can still see that today, which I think is particularly remarkable given the sort of war stopped a long time ago, but these foodways continue on and continue on through different generations.
Yeah, it's definitely still very much a thing in somewhere like Korea, for instance. And it comes with some other messaging, not just around kind of comfort food or even sort of, oh, this is stuff my grandparents ate, maybe if we're thinking about the timeline of the war. You mentioned in the book, especially if we look at places like South Korea, there's kind of other messages coming through as well with the Spam. Can you tell us about this?
So the idea about it being a kind of like a sort of valuable food or a connection with a sort of luxury good, which is interesting. So yeah, and, we think of Spam as sort of very, at least in the United States, we think of it as sort of very basic food that is there that we would go turn to if we don't have other meats, for example. But in Korea, it's very much part of these dishes that I was talking about. There's one point in Korea which is interesting. So after Korean War, Spam is not imported into the country. It's, there's kind of a 34-year gap when the only way you can get it is if you live in an American base or you smuggle it out of the American base and it's sold on the black market. And it becomes really expensive in that way. And it turns into kind of a luxury good. Only people who have money who can get it. And so I think that kind of stays with the meat when it starts to become on sale in 1987. They start selling it. So there's a local company called CJ Cheladong, which starts to produce it locally in Korea. So they have a contract with Hormel to produce it there, and they change the recipe slightly to make it less salty. But it sort of takes on a whole new life. It becomes almost part of Korean lifestyle. Then they even sell it now in during national holidays. So during Chuseok, which is a harvest festival in the autumn, and then Solal around the New Year, they sell it as sort of gift sets. So giving it as gifts to people, either like individual cans, or if you go to the grocery shop, you can find like several cans of Spam packaged together with fancy oil, and you give that to your friends and your family and your colleagues. And so that really changes the value. It gets really integrated into Korean life in that way, in a way that we would never use it in the US or the UK, which I find remarkable.
Yeah, that's definitely very interesting. There are, of course, some downsides to having Spam so integrated into foodways. Can you tell us about some of the long-term consequences of this love of Spam?
Yeah, so any sort of ultra processed food, if you eat it too much, you have higher risk of food related illnesses such as diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease, to name a few. And you can see in places, I mentioned already that Guam is sort of the highest consumer of Spam in the world outside of the United States. And you can see in places like Guam and indeed the Philippines, which is, I think, the third largest consumer outside the United States, that there are higher rates of these food-related diseases. And so this is not only from Spam. There are a lot of, American or ultra-processed foods that are being consumed, again, as a result of the war. And so you can see higher rates of these illnesses, higher rates of death. And so that's a really negative downside. You also see, because Spam is being integrated into traditional foodways, or, replacing them in some cases, that the traditional foods are not as healthy as they would have been if they're made with like meats that are not processed. And so that's changing that around as well. So by Spam becoming integrated into the foodways, it's sort of circumventing the health in a way of what the traditional dishes would have been to these populations, and creating these long-term intergenerational health issues going on there.
Yeah, that's definitely worth making sure is part of our conversation. If we then take a sort of zoomed out approach, looking at the many different countries and times and ways in which you've encountered Spam and documented it in the book, were there any particularly surprising ways that you've seen Spam appear in pop culture? So maybe in a film or something like that, or any favorites you want to give a shout out to?
Yes, I was. Yeah, I have a whole chapter on popular culture. I was really surprised when I started looking that the amount of sort of cult favorite this is, and the range of different ways in which it's represented. I hadn't seen it, or I hadn't been aware of it, I guess. There's so many interesting popular cultures. So as you sort of flag up the film, there's a really interesting short film, which is kind of bizarre in its way. I highly recommend people go and watch it. It's about a man sort of winning a Spam prize, and he sort of dreams his family loves Spam. And I won't give away the ending, but it's really interesting. It's almost, yeah, it's almost like a horror film in a sense. There's also like a Spam archive of like haikus that are sort of written about Spam and all different facets. I always think my personal favorite is like the Spam festivals. I think that would be really, really exciting. I mean, as a food historian, I always look out for opportunities to go to food museums and food festivals. And so Spam would be really interesting to go to. I know that in Minnesota every year they have the Great Get Together, which is essentially a state fair. And every year Hormel has a food stall. And so I went when I was in Minnesota, like looking around at the town where Spam is made and going to the Spam Museum, which I also highly recommend. At the state fair, they had a whole cart dedicated to Spam, and I thought that was really fascinating. They also have the Spam festival in Hawaii. So, as I mentioned, Hawaii is a huge consumer of Spam, hugely popular. And so every year in April, they have a sort of block party of, there's all different restaurants that offer all different unusual Spam dishes, and there's Spam merchandise. And I think there's different music and performance. And so that's all really fascinating. So spam really lives on in all these places, even if we don't think about it in that way anymore.
Yeah, this was definitely very fun to read about the many different places and ways in which spam shows up in popular culture. What about food, though? That is, of course, the kind of origin of this. So, were there any particularly surprising or intriguing recipe suggestions that you came across in this research?
Yes, so very many. I had to sort of carefully choose what was in the book. So at the end, there's all the different recipes from all the different countries which spam touched. I mean, one interesting one, although I don't know if I'd recommend it to people, is and I believe it's in the book or it's mentioned in the book anyway, is spam and tripe. So this was a World War II British recipe, and so people could make that. Um, Another really interesting one, when I visited the Spam Museum, they had this whole section in the museum where you can look up unusual recipes. And so one of the interesting recipes was Spam butterscotch cookies. And I didn't make it, I have to admit, but it sounds intriguing, because it's kind of the salt, sweet idea. So it may be very good. And there are many others. There's so many interesting recipes out there, and people are so creative with spam. It's such a versatile food that you can use it in sweet or savory things. And people do when they get really creative.
Definitely lots of different ways that spam can be used. I'm sure anyone interested can find all manner of things in the book and, of course, on the wider internet too. But definitely is a fun project that you've put together. The book has so many details that I can only imagine how much fun they would have been to come across in the archives. So thank you for giving us a taste of it. If I can ask, though, before I let you go, what might you be working on now that this book is done? Anything you want to highlight?
Oh yeah, so I'm always at work as a food historian. The one book that I'm working on right now, it's under contract with Amberley Press. I hope it to be out next year. It's the title is Rational Thinking: World War II Lessons for 21st Century Consumers. So this is not about spam, but it's still sticking with World War II. And essentially, what the book is, it takes World War II British food rationing recipes. So um, uh, in Britain during World War II, there was a sort of famous or popular radio program called The Kitchen Front on the BBC, and almost every day they would give recipes that you could use for rationing. And so I wanted to take those recipes and to consider sort of revisiting them and thinking about, could we use the recipes and the cookery knowledge contained in them to help modern consumers? So if we think of modern day, we deal with a lot of the same issues that people deal with in World War II, but for different reasons. So, we have to think about um, food resources. We have to think about waste. We have to think about reducing meat intake and sugar intake. And all these same things are happening in rationing. And so how did they deal with it? And are there things that we can see the ways in which they deal with it that we could use today? And so the book has a lot of recipes. That's part of it. But it's also commentary about what is the history behind these recipes? How does rationing work? And then how could modern consumers use these things? So I comment about, ways to adapt the recipes and also ways to think about these recipes in relation to environmental concerns that we are dealing with and will deal with in the future. So it's me sort of trying to merge my food history with modern day, and to sort of help start that discussion with consumers today and thinking about the future as well.
Very interesting. Best of luck with the project.
Thank you so much.
Well, you are off pursuing it. Of course, listeners can read the book we've been talking about, titled Spam, A Global History, published by Reaktion in 2025. Kelly, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Miranda. It was great talking to you.